Welcome, dear traveler. Tonight, we leave behind the comforts of hearth and home and step quietly into the shadowed places of Middle-earth. In the ancient days, before Greenwood was called Mirkwood, a darkness began to stir beneath its boughs. Threads of silver and grey drifted between the trees. The birds fell silent, the paths grew twisted, and far away, even the bravest hunters began to whisper of great, terrible spiders spinning a kingdom of web and fear. In this story, you will walk beside a lone soul, a wanderer who dared to enter the deep woods and who would discover that some evils are too ancient, too patient to ever truly die. Before we begin, if you would like more journeys into the forgotten corners of Middle-earth, gently, I invite you to subscribe and join me whenever you seek a world beyond the waking one. And now, hush your thoughts, wrap yourself warmly, and listen well, for the forest is already watching. In the dim light of late autumn, when the mists clung low to the mossy roots and the trees seemed to huddle closer together, a lone wanderer crossed the borders of Greenwood the Great, unaware that he was stepping into a story far older and darker than himself. He was a young ranger, not yet seasoned in the ways of deep forests, though his heart was brave and his blade sharp, and he had been sent by his chieftain to map the shifting paths near the southern reaches where strange tales had begun to spread among the woodmen. Tales of flocks vanishing from their fields, of hunters who did not return, of a soft, silvery dust drifting down like ash upon their doorsteps. But even these warnings could not have prepared him for the silence that met him as he passed beneath. The tangled canopy, a silence so complete it seemed to press against his skin, muffling even the sound of his own footsteps as he moved carefully through the thick underbrush, for the trees here grew too tightly together to allow for open roads, and the light that managed to seep through their blackened leaves was thin and sickly, casting no warmth upon the forest floor. He had heard once that Greenwood was a place of beauty, where the oaks and beeches rose proud and golden in the sun, where birdsong filled the air like falling rain, and flowers of every hue carpeted the clearings. But this part of the wood remembered none of that joy, for the trunks were gnarled and twisted, the branches clawed at the mist like desperate fingers, and an ashen pallor clung to every leaf, as though the trees themselves were slowly dying from within. More than once he paused, standing very still, sensing a tremor in the air around him, a faint vibration that brushed against his skin and hair like the touch of unseen webs. But when he turned to look, there was nothing, only the whisper of the mist curling along the ground and the distant creaking of limbs too heavy with rot. He tightened his cloak about him, more from instinct than cold, and pressed on, following the barely visible trail of crushed ferns and broken twigs left by those few who had passed this way before and not returned. And as he moved deeper, the sense of being watched grew stronger, not the bright attention of birds or curious beasts, but something slower, older, a gaze that weighed upon him like a heavy stone, as if the very forest had grown eyes that blinked unseen between the knots of bark and the hollows of ancient roots. Once he glimpsed a movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow flitting between two towering oaks, but when he turned, drawing his sword in a smooth, silent motion, there was nothing but the slow drift of mist parting around empty trunks, and he told himself it was the fog playing tricks on his mind, though he could not shake the feeling that whatever had moved had done so with purpose, with hunger. By midday, though the sun must have risen high above the world, the gloom within the forest had deepened, and the wanderer found himself treading a path so narrow and tangled that he often had to cut his way forward with slow, careful strokes of his blade. The silvery vines and fine strands of something thicker than ivy clinging stubbornly to his cloak and sleeves, and once or twice he had to stop and pick them off, feeling a faint prickle of unease as the fibers clung to his gloves. With a tenacity that seemed almost alive, he tried not to think of the old tales, the ones whispered beside fires in the north, of Ungoliant the Devourer, mother of all spiders, whose spawn had fled the dark places of the world to haunt lonely mountains and sunless woods, and he reminded himself that he was a man grown, a ranger of the wild. Not a child to fear every rustle and snap in the undergrowth, but the forest did not seem to care for such bravado, for as he rounded a bend in the path, he found himself staring at a tree whose trunk was wound thickly about with webs, layer upon layer of glistening silk, so dense that the bark itself could not be seen beneath it, and hanging from the lower branches were things he did not wish to name. Small bundles, wrapped tight and swaying gently in the mist, their shapes too human to be mistaken for anything else. Bile rose in his throat and he turned away, forcing his steps to quicken, though the path grew no easier, for now the air was thick with the scent of damp decay, of old flesh turned sweet and foul, and every branch seemed to tremble as if brushed by invisible legs. He did not call out, for he knew better than to raise his voice in a place like this, but he tightened his grip on his sword and moved with all the silent speed he could muster, weaving between the gnarled roots and low branches, heart hammering, a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and somewhere behind him, too soft to be certain, came the faintest sound of something following. The brush of many legs against dead leaves, the almost inaudible rustle of silk sliding across bark, and he knew then that he was not alone, that whatever had spun the webs and hollowed the forest was awake and aware of him. And though the rational part of his mind screamed for him to turn and fight, to face whatever horror lurked behind him, the older, deeper part, the part that remembered old songs and darker tales, urged him to run, to flee, for there were things in Middle-earth that no sword could cut, no courage could conquer. And so he ran, not blindly but with desperate purpose, weaving through the mists and blackened trees, never looking back, never slowing, as the webs thickened around him and the forest closed in, and far above, hidden among the writhing branches, unseen eyes blinked slowly open, watching, waiting, patient as the creeping death they had always been. Eyes beyond the fog. The mist thickened as the wanderer pressed on, swallowing the shapes of trees and turning the path into a ghostly corridor where every step sounded muffled and wrong, and though he dared not slow, the weight of unseen eyes bore down on him with suffocating force, like hands pressing against his back, herding him forward into deeper shadow. He could no longer tell whether he walked north or east, or some twisted course between, for the trees had shifted, subtly but surely, and the landmarks he had tried to mark, the splintered oak, the hollow stump, the forked birch, seemed to melt into the mist and vanish behind him like dreams forgotten upon waking. And the webs, oh the webs, they grew thicker here, draping from branch to branch like curtains of glistening ruin, catching what little light remained and twisting it into ghostly spectres that danced at the edges of his vision, whispering promises he dared not listen to. Once he thought he saw a figure standing among the trees, tall, draped in a tattered cloak with hair as pale as moonlight. But when he blinked, there was only mist, and the slow, aching creak of boughs strained under ancient webs. And yet the feeling that he was not alone deepened, sharpening into a certainty that gnawed at the corners of his mind like tiny, invisible teeth. He began to hear it then, soft at first, almost a trick of the ear, the faint padding of many feet across the forest floor, too light to be the tread of wolves, too synchronized to be any natural beast. A skittering, shuffling sound that seemed to rise and fall with his heartbeat, drawing closer when he slowed, retreating when he gathered his strength and pressed onward. And he knew with a sick, cold certainty that he was being stalked, that the hunter had become the hunted, and that it took its time because it could afford to, because in this place it was the master, and he, the fool, was already caught in its labyrinth. Once more he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, a flash of spindly limbs, a glint of black chitin slick with dew. But when he turned his head, there was only a trembling branch, and the slow drip of moisture from a web heavy with mist. Breathing carefully through his nose, he forced himself to slow, to think, to remember his teachings, for panic would only hasten his end. And he knew that creatures of the dark often thrived on fear, weaving it into snares stronger than any rope. If he could find a clearing, he might set a small fire, smoke them out perhaps, though a darker part of his mind warned that fire might only draw worse things to him, things that remembered Ungoliant's insatiable hunger and the black flame she had left in her wake. He shook the thought away, focusing instead on the feel of the ground beneath his boots. Still firm, not yet sinking into the marshes he had heard whispered of in the deeper south, and on the slight downward slope that suggested he was moving toward one of the forest's many hidden streams. If he could find running water, perhaps he could use it to mask his scent, though he could not say whether spiders cared for such things or if they hunted by other fouler senses. Ahead, the mist parted slightly, revealing a hollow where the trees drew back in a rough circle, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he saw something not shrouded in web or rot. A pool, small and dark, fed by a thin trickle of water that gurgled unseen among the stones, its surface so still it reflected the broken sky above in shattered fragments. He crept forward, crouching low, listening, always listening. But the soft padding sounds had ceased, replaced now by an unbearable silence, as if the very air were holding its breath, and he dared not linger, slipping to the water's edge and splashing his face and hands in the chill, biting current to clear his mind and spirit. For there was something clinging to him, something woven into the mist and web and silence that sought to slow his limbs and cloud his thoughts. The cold cut through the stupor like a knife, and he drank deeply, letting the icy taste of it anchor him to himself, to the simple, stubborn will to survive that had carried his people through countless forgotten wars. But even as he knelt there, he became aware of a reflection on the water's surface, not his own, not the broken sky, but something dark and many-limbed poised high above him among the trees, motionless and silent as a tombstone, and his heart lurched in his chest as he spun around, sword flashing in the dimness. But once more there was nothing, only the endless mist and the slow, mocking sway of a web-heavy branch. He wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve, every sense straining. And that was when he heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle, almost too faint to catch, drifting through the trees like the last gasp of a dying wind. And it was followed by a second, lower, more guttural, and he realized with a creeping horror that it was not laughter born of mirth, but the chittering communication of creatures so alien that even mockery sounded wrong in their mouths. He did not wait for them to come closer, for instinct screamed that delay would mean death, and he rose and fled the clearing, plunging once more into the twisted woods, the mist tearing at his cloak, the webs brushing his face and arms like skeletal fingers, and behind him, slipping through the trees with nightmarish grace, the spiders followed, their many eyes gleaming faintly in the gloom like cold embers. Patient, tireless, savoring the slow unraveling of their prey. Ahead, somewhere beyond sight, the forest grew darker still, and he knew he was running not towards safety, but deeper into the heart of the web, where even the bravest songs of the Eldar dared not tread. The first bite. The mist thickened until it became a heavy, clinging shroud, wrapping around the wanderer's limbs and throat with a damp, smothering touch, slowing his breath and weighting every step as he stumbled through the choking undergrowth. And though his heart thundered and his muscles ached, he dared not stop, for he could hear them now, not with his ears alone, but with the deep, ancient part of himself that knew when death was near, could feel the tremor of their many legs across the webbed ground, could smell the sour musk of their passing on the damp, rotting air. The forest had changed again, narrowing, pressing closer, as if it too were part of the trap, funneling him toward a place of the spider's choosing. And though some stubborn, desperate part of his mind screamed at him to turn back, to find a new path, he knew there was no turning, no escaping the weave once caught within it, and so he pushed forward, sword drawn low and ready, boots sinking slightly into the spongy earth with each reluctant step, until he came to a place where the mist parted in slow, reluctant coils, revealing a clearing so choked with webs that it seemed as though snow had fallen thick upon the ground and branches. Only this snow was glistening, sticky, pulsing faintly with a life of its own. He hesitated at the edge, his instincts screaming warning, but even as he drew breath to retreat, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure, or something that had once been a figure, wrapped and suspended among the low boughs, swaying, gently as though whispering some warning he could not hear, and beyond it, tangled in the dense, silk-strung branches, he glimpsed others, dozens perhaps. Some small as children, some larger, all cocooned tight, their features hidden beneath the thick layers of grey, and the sight rooted him in place, heart hammering a frantic rhythm as his mind struggled to accept the full horror of what he saw. Then a tremor, slight but distinct, shivered through the webs, and he snapped his gaze upward just in time to see it, a massive, glistening black form descending from the canopy above, silent as death, its many legs outstretched, mandibles twitching with anticipation, and before he could raise his blade fully, it struck, a blur of movement and weight that slammed into his side and sent him sprawling into the sticky undergrowth. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, and for a moment he lay stunned, his limbs tangled in the clinging strands, but training and terror forced him into motion, and he rolled aside just as the spider's dripping fangs plunged into the spot where his neck had been a heartbeat before, the ground hissing where its venom touched the roots and leaves. With a hoarse cry, he slashed upward, the blade biting into one of the creature's legs with a wet, cracking sound, and the spider recoiled with a shriek that vibrated through the webs and echoed off the mist-drowned trees. But before he could press the attack, another blow struck him from behind. Not the sharp, clean strike of a blade, but the suffocating, heavy touch of a silken rope flung with terrible precision, wrapping around his shoulders and arms and yanking him backward. With bone-jarring force, he stumbled, struggling against the tightening strands, hacking desperately with his sword, severing some, tangling in others, and from the corners of his vision he saw them, More spiders, smaller than the first, but no less deadly, emerging. From the mist like phantoms, their eyes glinting with cold hunger, their movements swift and sure. Pain flared suddenly in his calf as sharp fangs pierced his boot and flesh beneath, and he lashed out instinctively, kicking the offending creature away, even as cold fire spread up his leg, numbing the muscles and sending jolts of weakness through his frame. Panic rose in him, thick and choking, but he forced it down, focusing instead on movement, on survival, hacking and tearing and stumbling toward the far side of the clearing where the mist seemed thinner, the webs less dense. Another strand caught his arm, and he slashed it free. Another spider lunged, and he drove his blade deep into its thorax, feeling the sickening crunch and spurt of dark ichor against his hand, and all the while the forest around him shuddered. With the fury of the nest disturbed, the webs vibrating with the movement of 100 unseen legs, he could feel the venom working in him already, dulling his senses, slowing his reactions, making the world blur at the edges, but still he moved, driven by sheer stubborn will, by the bone-deep knowledge that to fall here was to become another. Swaying bundle among the trees, another nameless whisper lost in the mist. Finally, with a last desperate lunge, he broke free of the clearing, crashing through a curtain of torn webs and into a tunnel of twisted trees beyond, where the mist coiled lower and thicker, but the immediate pursuit seemed to falter, and he allowed himself a single ragged breath before staggering onward, blood leaking from the wound in his leg, the taste of metal and fear thick in his mouth. He did not dare look back, did not dare listen for the sound of pursuit, for he knew it would be there, always there, and that the spiders, once they had tasted him, would not give up the hunt so easily, not when the queen herself had yet to feed. The queen's threads. The wanderer staggered through the mist-choked trees, each breath a shallow gasp as the venom burned its slow, merciless course through his blood, gnawing at his strength with the patient cruelty of deep roots splitting stone, and though every step sent lances of pain through his wounded leg, and every heartbeat seemed to echo hollowly in his ears, he did not stop, could not stop, for the webs were growing thicker again, not in scattered strands or careless drapings, but in deliberate architectural patterns, sweeping from tree to tree in massive arcs that shimmered like glass in the faint, corpse-gray light filtering through the dying canopy. The very air seemed thicker here, weighted with an invisible tension that made the fine hairs along his arms and neck stand erect, and the trees themselves bent inward, bowing toward some unseen heart of darkness deeper still within the woods. Their bark blackened and split as though scorched by fire that had not burned for an age. He stumbled once, catching himself against a low-hanging web that clung hungrily to his cloak and gloves, and when he tore free with a grunt of disgust and terror, he found his hands coated in a fine, sticky dust, the crumbled remains of something that had once been alive, and the sickly sweet stench of old decay rose to clog his nose and throat, forcing him to swallow back bile. Ahead, the path narrowed into a tunnel, formed not by natural growth but by webbing so dense it formed walls and even a ceiling of silk. A suffocating corridor that led downward, deeper, and though every instinct within him screamed to turn back, to flee into the lesser darkness of the woods, he knew there was no other way, that to linger would be to be caught and devoured at leisure. With a low, wordless curse, he pressed forward into the tunnel, sword held before him, though it trembled now in his weakening grip. And as he moved, the walls seemed to ripple and breathe, contracting and expanding, as though the web itself were alive and aware of him, drawing him onward like a fish upon a hidden line. Faint shapes were caught within the silk, shadows that twisted and quivered as though struggling still, and sometimes he thought he could hear faint voices whispering his name, or perhaps only some ancient word of power he could not understand. A susurrus of pleading and despair and madness woven into the very fabric of the Queen's dominion. He dared not pause to study them, for fear that to look too long would be to lose himself entirely, to become one more voice in the endless whispering web. And so he pressed forward, every step heavier, every breath harder to draw, until at last the tunnel widened into a vast hollow, a chamber not crafted but grown, its walls rising high and jagged like the ribs of some immense and long-dead beast. And everywhere, the webs hung thick and heavy, layer upon layer, sagging under the weight of what they held. Here the mist was thinner, but the air was worse, still stale, choked with the sweet, rotting perfume of death, and though no breeze stirred the webs, they swayed and trembled as if moved by unseen hands. At the far side of the chamber, barely visible through the veils of silk, a shape moved, a vast, slow, deliberate, and though he could not yet see it clearly, he knew with a certainty deeper than reason that he was looking upon the Queen herself, the dark heart of the nest, the weaver of all these threads of despair. She was not like the smaller spiders he had fought, no mere beast acting on hunger alone, but something greater, something ancient, a will behind the weaving, a mind cold and cruel and enduring as stone. And as he watched, frozen in horror and awe, a strand of silk as thick as his arm uncoiled from the darkness, snaking lazily toward one of the cocooned bundles hanging low from the vaulted ceiling. With a slow, almost tender motion, the Queen drew the bundle upward, turning it this way and that, examining it, savoring it, before sinking her fangs deep into its heart. And though the distance was great and the mist thick, he could still hear the faint, wet sound of feeding, the dull, spasmodic shudders of the thing within the cocoon as it was drained of life. Something broke within him then, not fear alone, but a deeper, older terror, the bone-deep recognition of a predator so absolute that no blade, no courage, no prayer could ever hope to stand against it. And he stumbled backward, heedless of the noise, heedless of the tremble that shook the webs around him, desperate now only to escape, to flee this place and its nightmare queen. But even as he turned, the ground beneath him shifted and gave way, and with a choked cry, he fell, tumbling down a slick, sloping shaft, lined with sticky silk, spinning end over end in blind, suffocating panic, until he crashed heavily onto a lower level, the breath driven from his lungs and his sword skittering away into the darkness. Dazed, limbs trembling, he forced himself upright, squinting into the gloom, and realized with a surge of despair that he had fallen into another chamber, smaller, but no less terrible, where the webs hung even lower and the scent of death was so thick it was a physical thing, clinging to his skin and hair and tongue. And from the shadows he heard them stirring. The Queen's children, lesser spawn perhaps, but many, so many, their tiny eyes gleaming in the half-light as they crawled toward him, patient, relentless, and he knew that unless he found his strength, unless he moved now, he would never leave this place, would never see the sun again, would become just another thread in the endless, hunger-woven tapestry of the Queen's domain. Hollow voices. The darkness of the lower chamber was thicker, heavier, as if the very air had been woven into the Queen's great web, and the wanderer staggered to his feet, gasping against the weight of it, feeling it press against his skin and ears, muffling sound, dimming sight. And yet, through that suffocating gloom, he began to hear them, soft at first, like the distant sigh of wind through dead leaves, but growing clearer with each step he took deeper into the nesting hollow, voices hollow and trembling, calling. To him by name, by names he had never spoken aloud in these woods, names only known to those he had left far behind, and he froze, swordless, heart hammering, as the mist around him seemed to coalesce into familiar shapes, faces half remembered from distant firesides, hands reaching for him from within the hanging webs, their fingers pale and thin, their mouths forming words he could not quite hear, could not quite deny. Mother, father, brothers lost to battles long ago, a lover's smile faded with time, comrades who had fallen at his side beneath other kinder trees. All of them drifted before him now, caught in the Queen's weaving, whispering promises of rest, of forgiveness, of the end of loneliness and fear. And though reason screamed within him that this was trickery, that the Queen's magic was working upon his mind, some deep and battered part of his soul ached toward them, longed to reach out and be gathered into their arms, to lay down sword and burden and sleep forevermore. The webs underfoot grew stickier with every step, clinging not only to his boots but to his will, tugging at his strength, slowing him until each movement became an act of pure defiance against the tide of despair that threatened to drown him. And still the voices called, growing sharper now, sweeter, weaving memories and hopes together into a song more seductive than any he had ever heard. A lullaby spun from all the things he had lost, all the joys he had abandoned in his ceaseless wandering. Somewhere beyond the curve of the chamber, a low, wet rustling began, a sound that spoke of limbs unfolding, of fangs sharpening, of hunger gathering to a point, and he knew that the Queen was aware of him still, that this vision was her hunting cry, her net of dreams and sorrow thrown wide to catch the last flutterings of his spirit. He stumbled forward, half-blind with grief and venom and fear, and the mists parted around him to reveal a pillar of webbed silk rising from floor to ceiling, a ghastly monument within which dozens, perhaps hundreds of faces were trapped, mouths open in silent screams or smiles of false welcome, and as he drew nearer, the faces began to shift, to take on more familiar forms, until he saw himself among them, his own face staring back at him with wide, accusing eyes. And for a heartbeat, he faltered, swaying on his feet, the pull of the web stronger than ever, whispering that it would be easier, so much easier, to surrender, to let the Queen cradle him in her countless arms, to become part of the eternal weaving where pain and memory would be nothing more than threads lost in the dark. But somewhere deep within him, past the haze of poison and grief, a spark stirred, a stubborn flicker of the same will that had driven him across the wilds, had taught him to survive when all seemed lost, had whispered to him in other dark places that surrender was the true death, and with a snarl that was more animal than man, he wrenched himself free of the moment's thrall, tearing through the sticky floor webs, lurching forward with arms raised to shield his face as the silk tried to bind him tighter with every step. The faces screamed then, a thin, keening wail that echoed through the hollow, a sound not made by throat or tongue, but by the weaving itself, and the pillar shuddered as if in rage or pain. But he did not look back, forcing his numbed legs onward, heart-pounding, mind-reeling, until he found himself at the far side of the chamber, where a thin crack opened between two web-choked roots, a crevice barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, and with the last of his strength he hurled himself into that narrow gap, feeling the sharp tug of silk tearing at his cloak, at his hair, at his very soul, but somehow breaking free. tumbling into another tunnel beyond, where the mist was darker, colder, and for a few blessed moments, blessedly silent, save for the frantic rasp of his own breathing. He lay there a while, too weak to move, too wrung out by the Queen's illusions to think, and in that broken stillness he realized that he had seen but a glimpse of her power, a mere testing of his spirit, and that worse was yet to come. For queens of ancient darkness do not waste their true strength upon the unworthy, and if she spun such hollow voices merely to amuse herself, then the true heart of her lair, the true shape of her will, must be a terror beyond anything he had yet faced. Trembling, battered but not yet broken, he dragged himself to his knees, blinking into the deeper dark ahead, knowing that his path led onward still, into blackness and hunger and despair, and that he must walk it alone if he were to have any hope of surviving the Queen's threads. The hunger below! The tunnel twisted and dipped ever downward, the webs thickening once more into heavy curtains that clung to the wanderer's skin like old wet linen. And though he pressed on, stumbling through the choking dark, he knew that his strength was fading fast, the poison still pulsing through his veins, slowing his limbs, clouding his mind with feverish half-dreams in which the trees whispered of surrender and the mist shaped itself into cruel, laughing faces. The air grew colder with each step, the ground softer, more treacherous, and when at last he emerged into another cavern, vast, silent, and so deep beneath the earth that no light from the sun or stars could ever touch it, he fell to his knees, unable to rise, gasping as the overwhelming stench of rot and silk and ancient dust filled his lungs. Around him the chamber yawned wide, its walls lost in gloom, but he could feel the vastness of it pressing upon him, a hollow place at the very heart of the Queen's domain, where all paths ended, where all struggling things were gathered at last into stillness. He tried to push himself upright, but the webs beneath his hands shivered and shifted, and before he could cry out, they surged up around him like living things, tendrils of silk coiling about his wrists, his ankles, his chest, pinning him in place with a strength that no human hand could break. He fought, thrashing wildly, but the more he struggled, the tighter they wound, binding him from neck to heel in a cocoon of suffocating weight. And though he managed a hoarse, broken shout, it was swallowed immediately by the vast, empty silence of the pit. Helpless, pinned to the ground like an insect in some cruel hunter's collection, he could only watch as movement stirred in the darkness beyond, a mass of glistening blackness, too large to comprehend at first, shifting and gliding forward, on limbs that moved with horrifying grace, and he knew without doubt that it was her, the Queen herself, come to see her prize, to savor the final moments of another life drawn into her endless web. Her form resolved slowly as she approached, monstrous and terrible, a creature of nightmare and shadow. Her body bloated and gleaming with a sickly sheen, her countless eyes glinting like frozen stars, her mandibles twitching with anticipation. Around her, the floor of the chamber seethed with lesser spawn, pale and bloated and slavering, but they dared not approach too closely, for this feast belonged first to their mother, their goddess, their queen. The wanderer tried to turn his face away, but the silk held him too tightly, forcing him to stare upward into the cold, pitiless gaze of the ancient horror descending upon him, and he felt her will brush against his mind. A vast, alien presence, cold and slow and inexorable as the deep roots of mountains, and he realized that she was not merely hunting him for sustenance, but savoring his terror, weaving it into the slow, delicious satisfaction of her dominion. His mind buckled under the weight of it, the memories of his life flashing before him like falling stars, snatched up and unraveled thread by thread, his hopes, his regrets, his dreams all laid bare before her vast, hungering spirit, and for a moment, a terrible, endless moment, he felt himself slipping away, felt the last stubborn flame of himself guttering in the cold winds of her malice, and he almost surrendered. But somewhere deep within the coils of despair, a memory stirred, not of glory or triumph, but of a single quiet moment from his boyhood, standing beneath a clear sky among green fields, the smell of rain on the wind, and the simple, aching joy of being alive. And that memory flared like a spark, too small to destroy the darkness, but enough to resist it, enough to remind him that he was not born to be a thread in another's weaving, that even in this place of death and horror, he was still a creature of light, of will, of defiance. With a strength born of that stubborn spark, he wrenched against the cocoon, feeling the silk strain and tear in tiny fibers against his battered frame, and though the queen recoiled with a hiss that rattled the chamber's vaults, she surged forward again, mandibles snapping, fangs glistening with venom, determined to silence this insolent flame once and for all. The wanderer twisted, his hand, half numb but still his own, fumbling for the dagger hidden beneath his belt, the last weapon he had, and as the queen loomed above him, he drove the blade upward with every ounce of strength he could muster, feeling it bite into the dense silk at his chest, cutting, tearing, freeing first one arm, then the other. The spawn shrieked and writhed in fury around the chamber's edges, sensing the disruption, but the queen hesitated, sensing perhaps that the meal she had claimed was not yet fully bound, not yet fully hers, and that hesitation was enough. With a roar of effort that tore his throat raw, the wanderer ripped himself free of the cocoon, rolling aside just as the queen's fangs struck the ground where he had lain, sending up a spray of stone shards and silk fibers. Half blinded by pain, staggering on limbs that barely obeyed him, he stumbled toward the far side of the chamber, where a fissure opened into blackness beyond. A crack too small for the queen to follow easily. He dared not think, dared not hope, only move, driven by the primal need to survive, to escape the hunger that waited behind him. And though he knew he carried the queen's mark now, her venom in his blood, her touch on his mind, he also knew that as long as he breathed, as long as he fought, he was not yet hers, not yet a thread in her endless tapestry of death. He would fight and flee, and if the end came, it would come on his own terms, with a blade in hand and the fire of life still burning in his heart, defying the darkness to the last. Ash and silk. The tunnel ahead narrowed into a twisting passage choked with webbing, thick and clinging, pulsing faintly in the stifling dark as if breathing with a life of its own, and the wanderer, half crawling, half staggering, could feel the queens, children stirring in the gloom behind him, their anger sharpening the very air to a razor's edge, their pale legs scraping and skittering ever closer, drawn by the scent of blood and fear and rebellion. His dagger, sticky with remnants of silk and ichor, shook in his hand, and though every muscle screamed for rest, for surrender, he pressed on, knowing that speed alone would not save him now, that the webs were thick enough to slow and snare him before long, and that if he did not act, he would be wrapped once more, fed upon at the queen's leisure. His mind raced, clawing for memories of stories, of old wisdom whispered among the ranger's fires, tales of how fire, bright and wild and hungry, was feared even by the darkest spawn of Ungoliant. how no web, however ancient or enchanted, could withstand the simple purity of flame. Breath ragged, heart hammering, he fumbled at his belt, finding the small pouch of tinder and flint he always carried, fingers clumsy and slow from the lingering venom. And for a heartbeat he hesitated, knowing that to light a fire here would mean not only a chance at escape, but a summons to every horror lurking in the Queen's realm, an invitation to all things that slumbered in the deeps to rise and see what fool dared disturb their endless night. But there was no other choice. And with a whispered prayer to stars he could no longer see, he struck flint to steel. Sparks danced in the suffocating dark, catching on a torn scrap of his cloak, and he blew upon it with desperate care, coaxing a frail orange tongue into trembling life. And with a cry half of triumph and half of defiance, he thrust the flame into the nearest web. The silk caught with a hiss, flaring upward in a sudden brilliant blaze that painted the tunnel walls in wild, lurching shadows, and for the first time since entering the Queen's domain, the wanderer saw the full horror of what surrounded him, the endless bodies suspended in their wrappings, the matted nests of her spawn writhing with pale, sightless young, the carcasses of beasts and men alike sucked dry and discarded like broken dolls, and the sight burned itself into his mind even as the fire raced outward, hungry and unstoppable. The webs above and around him ignited in great sheets of flame, and the chamber filled with the high, shrieking cries of the spiders, a sound so piercing and full of malice that it set his teeth on edge. But still he pressed forward, shielding his face with his arm as burning strands rained down around him, stumbling through the rising smoke toward the widening mouth of the fissure ahead. Behind him, the Queen screamed, a vast, shuddering bellow of rage and pain that shook the very stones of the earth. And he spared a glance over his shoulder to see her thrashing amid the inferno, her immense body writhing as fire consumed. The silk that had been her throne, her kingdom, her womb. But even as she burned, even as her spawn fell from the walls like embers, another sound rose from the deep, a groaning, grinding noise like the cracking of ancient bones, and the ground beneath his feet trembled and heaved, as though something vast and terrible had been roused from a long, unwilling sleep by the tumult of fire and death. The fissure before him cracked wider, belching forth a blast of fetid air that reeked of ash and rot and things too old for names. And he stumbled back from it, horror clawing at his heart as a shadow moved within that deeper darkness. Something greater even than the Queen, something that had slumbered beneath her webs, forgotten, patient, enduring. Tendrils of blackness slithered from the fissure, not smoke, not mist, but something thicker, something almost solid. And as it touched the walls and floor, the flames sputtered and dimmed, as if light itself recoiled from its touch. The Queen shrieked again, a cry not of rage but of fear, and for a heartbeat the wanderer saw her not as the predator she had been, but as prey, writhing in terror before the thing she had unknowingly sheltered. Heart pounding, he turned and fled, stumbling through the collapsing tunnel as fire and darkness battled behind him, coughing as smoke filled his lungs, batting away strands of burning silk that clung to his cloak and hair. His mind reeled, trying to grasp what he had awakened, what greater horror now stirred in the depths. But he forced the thought aside, focusing only on escape, on survival, knowing that if he faltered now, if he paused to wonder or despair, the darkness would seize him, and he would never see the light again. Onward he fled, through tunnels that groaned and shifted, through mists that clung and whispered, past the smouldering remains of webs and the twitching corpses of the Queen's children, until at last he burst into a narrow tunnel of bare stone, where no webs hung, where the air, though still heavy and foul, did not pulse with the Queen's living will, and he allowed himself a single, shuddering breath of hope. Behind him, the chamber collapsed in a roar of flame and stone, the sound echoing up and up through the bones of the earth, and he knew that whatever ancient thing had been roused would now be free to roam the deeps. But that was a doom for another day, another tale. And for now he lived battered and broken but free, carrying the scars of ash and silk and terror with him as he staggered onward toward a dawn he could only pray he would live to see. Gone on blackened trees. The tunnel sloped upward at last, and the wanderer stumbled forward with what strength remained, his legs trembling, his hands raw and bloodied, the weight of smoke and venom and exhaustion pressing down on him like a burial stone. Yet still, he moved, driven by the blind, aching instinct to find light, to find air that did not reek of death and ash, to feel the wind on his skin once more. Behind him the earth continued to rumble and groan, a slow, sullen anger that spoke of wounds torn open far below, and he dared not look back, dared not imagine what might now be crawling through the broken chambers where the Queen's webs once ruled supreme, for he knew that some evils once stirred do not easily return to sleep. The passage narrowed, the ceiling dropping low enough that he was forced to crawl, clawing his way forward through crumbling soil and ash-smudged stone, until at last, ahead, he saw it. A thin seam of grey light, weak and cold, but glorious, beyond words, filtering through a crack in the collapsed ceiling above. With a broken cry, he dragged himself upward, scrambling and clawing at the loose stones, heedless of the pain, heedless of the blood that smeared the rocks, until he burst free, sprawling onto a slope of blackened earth beneath a sky painted in the pale colors of false dawn. The trees here were few and stunted, their trunks scorched and twisted, their leaves no more than brittle ghosts trembling in the thin wind, and the ground was littered with the remnants of webs burned to fine, grey ash, swirling in eddies around his battered form like the sighs of the dead. He lay there for a long time, too weak to rise, staring up at the sky as it brightened slowly from iron to pewter to the faintest shade of pearl. And in that pale, growing light, he felt the first true breath of hope since entering the forest's heart, a fragile thing, trembling and uncertain but real. He could still feel the Queen's mark upon him, the burning wound in his calf, the aching venom still coiled like smoke within his blood, the ghostly touch of her voice at the edges of his dreams. But he was free, and so long as he lived, her victory was incomplete. After a time, he pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet, swaying unsteadily, and turned his gaze back toward the tree line where the mist still lingered, dense and secretive, veiling the broken paths and fallen. Webs of the realm he had escaped. He wondered, with a shiver he could not suppress, how many others had fallen there. How many nameless souls had been woven into the Queen's endless hunger. How many had heard the hollow voices and answered their call. He would carry their memory. With him, he knew, a burden and a warning. And though he would leave this place behind, its shadow would stretch long across his path in days to come. He turned away then, setting his feet toward the distant hills, where the trees thinned and the air grew sweeter, and with each painful step he felt a little more of the forest's grip slip away, though he knew some part of it would always linger, coiled within him like a forgotten song. The wind rose as the sun breached the horizon at last, casting pale light across the scarred land, and in its thin warmth he felt the first stirring of strength, of the will to endure, to heal, to carry. Forward, the story of what had been seen, what had been survived. Behind him, deep beneath the blackened trees, the Queen's dominion smouldered and fell silent. But the deeper hunger he had awakened would stir again one day, and others would follow unwitting paths into the dark. And so the world would turn, and the web would weave and unweave itself in endless cycles. But for now, in this fragile, trembling moment between night and day, he lived, and that was enough. And so, dear traveler, this is the end of our tale tonight. The webs have fallen silent, and the first light of dawn touches the blackened trees. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden corners of Middle-earth, I warmly invite you to subscribe, whispered gently, so you can return whenever you seek another story beyond the waking world. Rest well, sleep deeply, and may the stars guard your dreams.